Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new series of interviews with global thought leaders and industry disruptors for citiesabc.com. Our series has been growing, and since we start, we've been reaching a bigger audience worldwide and interviewing some of the leading thought leaders, academics, and industry drivers that are changing the world, and as well coming up with different possibilities, especially for all the challenges that we face nowadays with the inception of the COVID-19 pandemic, and as well with all the challenges that we're facing in the economy and our cities and countries. Today, we have with us Michael Sung, that is a reputable fintech expert and thought leader that has been as well probably dividing his career as an academic, as a professor at Fudan University, and as well the founder of CarbonBlue, that is a platform related to and creating different areas of bridge between finance, fintech, and a lot of different things in terms of policy making, and as well building software and different areas. Michael, welcome to our series, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure to be here, Dinis.
So, Michael, I would like to, so you have a quite interesting background because you are American Chinese, but now based in China, and as well a lot of experience in Hong Kong. So I would like to get your background, especially nowadays with all so much geopolitics, and I think global footprint is more important than ever, but unfortunately we have a lot of issues. So can you just give us a bit of your background? How do you come right now to be, I'm here in London, you are in Shanghai, a bit of how your trajectory to be on where you are right now?
Yeah, I mean, so born and raised in the United States, actually pretty whitewashed American, culturally, quite grew up in the East Coast and on the West Coast. So I have a very standard American upbringing. Very technical person. I went to school at MIT, did my PhD there at the MIT Media Lab. I was sort of combining a lot of early machine learning with wearable computing. I was at one point the principal investigator for the MIT Wearable Computing Group, and then doing a lot of what we now call quantified self type application, big data applications with data mining of human behavior. So that's my background. But then after I graduated, start this 20-year journey to be a serial entrepreneur. Basically did the 0 to 1 thing, basically developed a lot of companies in the semiconductor electronic space with new materials, diamond materials for thermal management and semiconductor applications. So started an LED company, started a solar company, and a couple of semiconductor processing companies where I helped to build the manufacturing in a few different continents. And then during the 08 crisis, pivoted to Asia because I lost funding for my solar company at the time. And basically understood that coming into China at that time, there was a huge need for advanced technologies into the country. So I started repositioned myself as to do my business in China. Got my ass handed to me the first company that I did in China because I didn't, I was trying to start a Silicon Valley style company, and my partners were doing land deals, and there was misalignment in terms of incentives. But I figured out that there was a great need for technology in China, so kind of repositioned myself as a tech transfer cross-border specialist, trying to take different technologies to bring into the greater China ecosystem. And then instead of focusing on early stage stuff, right, the 0 to 1 thing, I started focusing on the 1 to 1,000 thing, to be a commercialization scale expert on how to do business, and that kind of business venture building, I call it, to take a technology, to take a team, industry expertise, government relationships, financing, and to put those together into viable businesses is what I focus on. So then I became a part-time academic at HKUST, where I teach how to do business in China, how to do tech entrepreneurship and innovation thinking, so focus on that. And then more recently, have moved over to Shanghai, where I have really focused on fintech, right? So I run the Fintech Research Center at the new Fanhai International School of Finance, focused on very practical applied research on how to take these modern technologies like blockchain, and also all the business model innovation around tokenization and digital assetization, and then try to interface that with the institutional world. How to get traction with institutions in a regulated way, and focus also as a faculty at a national China Institute of Economics and Finance. It's a think tank on fintech innovation. So we're actually giving recommendations to the government on how to do these things in an enlightened manner.
Well, you have a quite impressive background, and I think one of the things that for me it's quite amazing is the way you bridge the academic world, the policy making world as well, and then the technology and the entrepreneurship, and as well the investment. So being an American from Chinese base, but right now based in China, but as well we have been working with Hong Kong, with Taiwan, a lot of different areas. So in terms of this multicultural background, which is I think super wealthy and super important nowadays, and as well these different areas between the academic, the technologies, and entrepreneur, how do you balance all these different things, and how would you be your kind of approach towards people that are looking at somehow learning with people like you, and as well probably for your students?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting question. I actually teach this to my my students. You know, I actually at HKUST taught it's called High Tech Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and it was literally the only class in the whole university which was like a meld of MBA students from the business school with PhD and master students from the engineering school. And that mix, interdisciplinary mix, I think is at the heart of the type of entrepreneurship style that I try to teach, where basically all the interesting things happens at the intersection of things, right? If you do something within an industry, then you have to be a very strong industry leader to really make a difference, right? Because it's kind of like a red ocean situation where there's a lot of competition, a lot of people who are smarter and more motivated than you are, right? But if you kind of take, say, an algorithm that things, and you see that in you know, how I position myself. I position myself as a bridge between the West and the East, right? The China ecosystem and the Western ecosystem. We can get into some of the interesting dynamics these days of that. I also position myself as a bridge between the academics with the industry, with the government, right? Between technology and finance. And so, you know, having those kind of interconnectivity provides a lot of flexibility to the innovation, the business models, and also the value add that you have for those different things.
So coming back to from an education at MIT and very American driven, now teaching in universities in China, how do you see the changes? Because I think we are in a very sensitive moment of history where we have the East taking over the West in terms of innovation, in terms of funding, in terms of even dynamics of culture and politics. But we have a lot of fears and myths. So how would you demystify, you being an American Chinese and as well having completely premium education in the West, but now teaching in the East? Because I think that's very important probably for our global audience, and as well you being completely American, but as well now becoming more and more Chinese. So how do you see these two angles? Because I think that's kind of really important to highlight that, and I'm sure for your students it's critical, but as well for everyone in the world.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? These days, you know, I have to say I'm a very, you know, entrenched again culturally. You know, I was born in the States of the American system. I'm a very proud American. But at the same time now, I'm Chinese by heritage, and I'm trying to connect between China. And it's almost like an oxymoron to be able to bridge these two areas. You have to a little bit choose sides these days, and I refuse to do so. I feel that the future of humanity lies in the ability for both sides to play nice with each other. And, you know, I've been thinking actually as an academic, about the game theoreticals of this, right? You know, like basically the situation that we see ourselves now is kind of like a classic prisoner's dilemma type of game theory, right? Where, you know, to describe that, basically, there's a classic game theory case where, you know, you have two prisoners which get caught, and they have to actually decide whether or not to rat each other out. And, you know, in the enlightened case where they try to collaborate, they both get out of jail. And if they rat each other out, they get better treatment. This is what the police in this situation are trying to enforce. And if they both rat each other out, it's a lose-lose case, right? So this is exactly what's happening in the world, is these sort of game theoretics, you know, prisoner's dilemma game theoretics, where essentially China is getting too strong. The U.S. side, you know, feels that, you know, in a decade, if China gets too strong, it'll be uncontained. So let's just cut off China off at the knees any which way possible. So this is a very classic, you know, dynamic in Cold War kind of philosophy and this kind of thing, right? I believe that, you know, in modern times with the world with COVID and, you know, possibly the greatest depression that we'll ever see economically in our lifetimes, you know, we need to figure out ways to develop more win-win dynamics. And I'm very interested in looking at the game theoreticals of using blockchain and smart contract technology as an example, which can enforce trust where, you know, the dynamics doesn't really allow that in a conventional setting, right? So I sit at this very interesting intersection where I have to be very balanced. You know, I'm certainly an advocate of China coming up on the world stage, but I feel that this is not necessarily at the total cost of the U.S. If the U.S. is a little bit more, you know, enlightened to the fact that, you know, they can win just as strongly by cooperating with the Chinese rather than trying to contain China, which I think is a difficult task given the dynamics. I was actually at a 2 years ago, I spoke at the UN in New York as an expert witness on AI, right? And at the time, this was before the relationship got toxic, but people were starting to talk about the tech war, right? The AI tech war and the trade war was just starting to ramp up. And I was asked to speak about who was going to win this AI tech war: the U.S. with Google and you know, the fundamental research advantage, or China rising kind of thing. And I got up and said, you know, at the time, something a little bit more controversial, which was that I don't think there is a war, right? Because if there was a war, I think China had already won, right? And I think that was, you know, then I noticed the, you know, sour faces in the audience, and it was actually my first experience in terms of a palpable different change in the mentality on at least in the U.S. side, right? But I strongly believe this, meaning you know, if you look at the dynamics of China coming, you know, into its own strength in technologies like AI and now blockchain, I think it is very difficult to contain or try to reduce their speed of advantage in that space. And in the decades to come, that advantage will be much more pronounced because there's a lot of systemic dynamics at play, right? Just the size of the market in China, where they own the supply and the demand side. So they, within their own ecosystem, China can actually scale innovation much more rapidly than in the West. So there are a lot of these interesting dynamics that we can talk about, right? So what I've been really a proponent for is trying to figure out ways that the West can win in partnership with China. And we can talk about that in the context of maybe some of this blockchain strategy that comes out, right? I notably sit, you know, I'm working with different, you know, organizations on trying to create these win-win strategies, right? Public-private partnerships where we can take private money into the public domain and do infrastructure development, which will be in service of the digital economies in the developing zone areas, and also applying you know, partnership models where the West and their leadership in technology and finance can be combined with Chinese, strategies, like, for example, on the Belt and Road, and then in service of humanity in terms of developing the digital economy stacks for developing countries, which will enable financial inclusion and enlarge the pie for both sides of the fence. I think that's a strong theme for me these days.
Yeah, that's quite inspiring, and I think completely necessary. So one of the angles as an expert in innovation doesn't know borders, and it needs to get open mind and open spirit, and especially, like you said, cross collaboration between different countries, different cultures, different kind of organizations. So on your experience, and especially coming back to fintech and to blockchain, so these technologies are definitely, and AI, of course, if you put the three together, we have the fourth industrial revolution in mainstream. How do you see fintech specifically with so much, so one of probably the biggest challenge we have right now is that we have the technology more advanced than ever, but in the end of the day, the technology is not being perceived by countries and cities in general. And we have to be realistic that, for instance, 90% of the world economy is still paper and is still offline. And then we have the financial industry that is just right now almost 90% online and digital. So we have a paradox between different things. And as well, for instance, if you look at Asia, especially China, in the last 10 years, China became one of the most developed fintech powerhouses in the planet. And it's been kind of innovating ways behind, I think, everyone. It's probably some exceptions in Europe, even if you compare with the US. So how do you see the dynamics of innovation, but as well when it comes to fintech, blockchain and AI, all these different dynamics that in one end you need all this open capacity that you are an evangelist and as well an expert, but in the other end we have the reality. And the reality is that 90% of the world economy is still paper. And we see this right now with the COVID-19, where actually we cannot even get along to just get masks and very basic stuff. And this is kind of, in one end, very scary for people like us, but it's reality. And we need to look at these two angles right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually this post-COVID world that we live in, this new normal, is going to change things dramatically. The need to do things online and not in the traditional way where we need to have handshake meetings and things like that. I don't think that's going to change even after the virus has been beaten. I think that's going to really be a profound force in the long term shift in how people interact and do business. So there's an online trend, and because of that, there has to be a strong digitization trend, right? I'll use an example. Like I think I have a friend who is working on developing the trade facilitation platform for ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, called TradeFlow. Right, and he put together a partnership with the Singapore government and in partnership with the ICC to basically digitize all the trade documentation and then facilitate that online. Right, the bills of lading, all that process is very manual and error prone and offline. Right, and so he has this nice demonstration, but basically stopped because of the fact that the laws in different countries do not allow that to happen. Basically, the legal standing of a PDF, bills of lading, or a trade document is not the same as the paper version. And so there was, basically, even though digitization can massively optimize this process, there was this lag in terms of the legal or regulatory environment, right? So, but that has changed dramatically post-COVID, right? Now governments are desperate to find ways to reduce cost, to allow their SMEs to survive in this post-COVID world. And a big aspect of that is to allow them to get a hold of the tools that will allow them to thrive in the new sort of digital economies of the future, right? And so I think toward that end, fintech in general, it will be more massively driven because of the environment that occurs. And so that is actually one major strategy that I'm trying to help to push, is the putting together the fintech stacks, to allow, say, these struggling SMEs in a developing country like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, or these areas where much of the local economy has been devastated by the COVID situation, and now give them this magic box of commoditized tools, which will allow them to more efficiently conduct trade, more efficiently settle payments, more efficiently conduct e-commerce, and have everything integrated in one solution. I think these are the tools of the future, which will get us out of this crisis.
So, I want to go, and I think especially probably coming back to your work in the Fudan University, and as well in terms of a lot of other areas that you've been working. So, you touch a very important thing, is that the tools exist, the tools are unstoppable, they are more advanced than ever, but then the reality is that we have most of our leaders not understanding the tools, and our regulators, even worse, probably blocking a lot of the tools. But at the same time, we have geopolitical multinationals that are moving at the velocity that you cannot stop. So that's in one end vertical, and comes back to your background of education, a vertical of technology and implementation, but as well a huge part of policy making and the relationships between governments or kind of leadership organizations and private and public that you mentioned. So how would you see that in your present work, and as well probably coming back to CarbonBlue, which I think partly is to tackle this, and how do you try to be practical to look at this? And for instance, we are in Cities ABC, which is a platform precise to unite and reinvent cities and come up with solutions. How do you say, let's say, someone that is leading a city in Europe or in Africa, how can we help them, and how can we help each other? Because this is kind of critical for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the timing cannot be more right, I think, for a push to develop a more integrated strategy for the future of digital economies in a city or for a government or for a country, right? I think as I mentioned, we have this incentive now by governments to adopt these technologies in ways that are at a massive, more larger scale than before, right? You're right, it is a very complicated intersection where you need to have the regulatory approval for things like fintech. This makes a huge difference because a lot of it is regulatory approval to allow digital assets, to allow cross-border payments using new tools and technology. And so, whereas before this would be a very slow process, right? Now I think there's a massive acceleration in that process because of the fact that the governments need to have solved these sort of existential issues. And because fintech actually plays a huge role in financial inclusion, for example, and is very suitable to address sort of the bottom of the base of the pyramid of the economy, which is the SMEs, right? Which is 80% of some of these ecosystems. I think there's a huge ability to connect the dots, and you're right in the sense that it's a very cross-disciplinary problem, and a problem that I feel is very interesting to play in. So going direct to the governments at the very top level. And also to vertically integrate a tech stack solution, right? From, say, the base protocol layer, which might be this blockchain services network, to the fintech architecture and infrastructure in between, to have digital exchanges and wallet technologies and KYC and digital identity, custodial, all that middleware level stuff to enable the economy to latch on to the application level stuff, so that we can put together these full stacks, and then also put together the financial innovation to allow this infrastructure to actually scale, and then also to connect the international partnerships where, for example, we can take a lot of the big data solutions for financial products from China, right? For Ping An or Alibaba, these days it's so modern in their economies. You know, as a SME business, all I need to do is push a couple buttons on my phone, and I get a microloan approved, you know, within seconds, directly deposited to my digital wallet. That sounds like the future. That's been practiced massively in China, right? So we should take that technology and those products offerings and allow that to spread into the developing world, because the developing world truly needs it. So that intersection of how to combine these things is a very important strategy. I focus again as a commercialization scale business model innovation expert, right? So the idea would be to do this top-down stuff. If we can get the governments to align on these general principles, and then we give them the tools to be able to do it. Plus, we form from a business model innovation standpoint, the partnerships from the financing to the technology to the industry partners, and put it all together in a framework where their incentives are aligned. Then we can really move mountains.
So you touched actually the hardcore part, and the vision is really amazing, and I think it's something that I really share and nurture. But the challenge is definitely that is a very difficult task. And for instance, my experience working with governments is that the education angle, it's critical. The policies are even more critical, but the technology is not stopping. So on your work as a teacher, and as well someone that comes from a West hardcore premium education, now in the East as well, in the leading universities in China, how do you see right now the nitty-gritty of going from the theory to the practice? Because that's the challenge right now. The challenge is that we have, like you said, the COVID-19 is opening a huge opportunity, and I will come back to what the Chinese government is doing right now with blockchain, which is amazing. And to be honest, I would love that all the governments would be doing the same and aligned. But the reality is that, like you mentioned, at the moment the world economy is creating, we are in a massive recession with the challenges that are really bigger than we can actually ever imagine in a lot of different areas, and probably the worst in the last 200 years. And the challenge is that, of course, this is going to create a huge social unrest that we need to tackle. So as a teacher, an academic, and a policymaker, and sorry, I want to highlight this because you are a unique, privileged position of being educated in the best of the world, of the West world, and as well right now in the East. And I think we need definitely that input from someone like you that can make that bridge. And I love the way that you are a bridger maker. We have a lot of different ways. I'll call you bridge maker, but I like that because this kind of building bridges is more important than ever. So how can we really go to the nitty-gritty? Let's say, for instance, you mentioned Bangladesh, you mentioned all the countries that are really, for instance, Bangladesh is being completely destroyed because the Bangladesh economy, because the garment industry is probably 80% of their economy or more. And of course, being caution in consideration that no one is buying fashion at the moment, of course, the entire industry and the entire country is stopped. So how can we really right now coming up with these tools? And as well, I know that you work in a lot of tools and a lot of strategies on this. Let's say one concrete example, because I think we need realistic examples, and we need to take, like you said, dismantle geopolitics and come up with the practicality. Because if people see functionalities and utility, they probably will be more hopeful, and they'll start blaming other people, because that's the challenge that we're facing right now.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting period in time right now where a lot of these technologies are maturing and commoditizing, frankly, to a point where system integrating these functionalities is something that actually is possible. Right? If we were talking, blockchain has now been around for, about a decade, and it's really just in the last, I would say year or so where the technologies has gotten to the point where we can start thinking about practical applications, get really institutional traction, get the regulation side. So I think we really live in a very unique period of time in the history of humanity where the technology is maturing. The regulation is coming online, and regulation is always slow, as you mentioned, but because of the post-COVID environments, the regulations can move much faster. You see, for example, the U.S. even entertaining digital dollar in their $2 trillion stimulus package. That was shocking. 2 months before, you would never think that. Yeah, and now it's written into an actual stimulus bill, so that, we see some regulation moving. And then what I think is now the only missing piece is the business model innovation to allow these pieces to come together and to be able to scale. And that's why I'm very, very interested in digital assetization, because really at, the tokenization of value is really what can align different stakeholders, sometimes in completely misaligned situations, to actually move together toward a common purpose, right? So, so to get a little bit more concrete, because these technologies and the regulatory environment is such that we can actually system integrate capability. And again, these technologies are essentially commoditized. So I can take a big data piece, right? I can take a cross-border, payment piece, and I can take, the industry specifics of that, and I can put it together and make something that will be practically used by those populations, right? So, so I think before, if you look at innovation, I study innovation quite a bit, right? And if you look at the standard model for innovation, startups, right? You have, a startup team, and that startup team is actually doing everything, right? Usually, if it's an AI startup, then you have this business guy who's trying to put together an AI team, and that AI team has to be less than C level, right? Because the A levels will go to Google, the B levels will go to people who can pay them, and then the C's and D levels are the ones that a small startup can actually employ. So they're actually trying to leverage, I would say, talent and also put together solutions which are highly unoptimal. Okay, so what a startup should do should focus on the business problem in the industry. Right. So let's say in Bangladesh, right, the garment industry is so totally devastated. So what is the fintech solution that would allow these garment manufacturers to get the funding that they need to make payments or to conduct trade in a fashion that they can actually survive, right? There are a lot of industry experts. All those people are there to be able to do that, but they don't have the tools, right? They don't have the big data tools. They don't have the IT infrastructure, whatever. If we can provide them this commoditized technology, right, and give them the ability to focus on the business problems, not focus on trying to create a tech stack, which they're totally not positioned to do, then I think there will be a lot of more traction. So I'm thinking about these type of strategies. It's more of a business model innovation strategy than anything else, right? I want to give a toolkit of the critical technologies which will allow massive financial inclusion and massive adoption in these developing regions, right? So I call it a vertical accelerator, right? So again, instead of having a startup where you are required to do every element and then you do everything poorly and there's a huge failure rate for startups, you should just you should enable the people to actually focus on the business problem, and then you provide the whole portfolio of technologies which they can use and mix and match and do whatever. So that's my general strategy, and that's what I'm hoping to do in these developing economies, is to provide these tools so that we can go into these economies and really build solutions that actually have a nice product market fit for the local environment.
So on that level, then I think we should talk about your roles right now, and I think it's particularly important for our audience and about your background. So at the moment you have, let's start with your work as faculty professor in the China Institute of Economics and Finance, which you've been working in the last 2 years. So this is particularly important, especially with your background, international background and research capacities. So how have you been working with this department, as especially the think tank from China, which is a major one, but as well in your experience as an entrepreneur, as a technologist, and as an academic?
Well, as usual, my role is to be a bridge or a connector, right? So I think there's a lot of more smarter and more dedicated people who've figured out the best practices for example, digital assetization. I was spending a lot of time in Switzerland, notably, right? Switzerland or Singapore or Hong Kong, a few of these places which are the most, I would say, conservative of all the financial ecosystems, yet they're the first to allow regulated digital assets to really take hold, right? So those people who worked out the regulatory best practices, right, worked out the legal frameworks for allowing crypto assets to be asset backed and to do all that kind of stuff. They've already done all the hard work. So what I'm doing is trying to modulate their expertise and best practices into the China context, right? So because of course the Chinese government has their own concerns and considerations, and sometimes even the terminology makes a difference in how you address these things. So therefore what I'm trying to do is taking the best from the West, modulating that, and allowing them to thrive in the China ecosystem. It's my strong notion, okay, that China will take a world lead in the regulation of digital assets and the implementation and the massive adoption institutionally, right? It looks like China is really against crypto, right? Because they banned Bitcoin, Binance got kicked out. If you look at any sort of regulatory heat map in a Western-based publication, China is in red as a no-go zone kind of thing, right? So, but I think it belies the what the strategy that China is doing. China is basically cleaning up, I think the bad behavior that they view in the ICOs. Like the ICO craze in 2017 was a 10x problem in China, right? So we call them air coins. There was a lot of, I would say, bad behavior, a lot of people getting tricked, MLM scams, all sorts of shenanigans, right? So they're cleaning all that out. And when they do that, they're going to come really fast with the regulated version. I know this because I know of basically the top institutions, banking institutions, large conglomerates making pilgrimages to Zug in Switzerland and going to Switzerland to really understand what's going on. And once they figure out, they're going to flip a switch and allow this massive opportunity, not only in the mainland, but then to spread to the developing world, right? So I'm really focused, therefore, on trying to connect the best Western thought leaders to this ecosystem to allow both sides to play in this new digitized asset world, which I think is going to be the largest, the next digital disruption that's going to occur, right? The first internet was the digitization of information, which allowed that to be democratized to the masses and all the business model innovation that came out on that. The next phase will be the digitization of anything of value, which is of course the whole economy, right? So once you give these tools to the masses, and I want to do this to the developing world, so I mean starting first with China and its greater China ecosystem, but very quickly to spread to the developing world, you will democratize these tools for the digital economy for everyone, and then therefore everybody can benefit.
So picking on that, you wrote recently actually a piece in CoinDesk about your opinion about Chinese position and how China national blockchain policies is going. It's called Blockchain-Based Services Network (BSN). Is critical parts of China national blockchain strategy, and this right now is coming from the top. So this is quite amazing because it's coming, let's say, independent of all the geopolitics. The China government is taking the most advanced technology in the world and making it mainstream, coming from the top. Where we have in the rest of the world stupidities, and I'm sorry on that level, I don't care about the geopolitics, but we have a huge amount of alarming amount of even the basic innovation. So this definitely shows how cutting edge the Chinese government is taking these technologies, but it shows as well that probably it's going to create more alarming close to the rest of the world. So let's divide this in two parts. I would like. So the first part is really the innovation coming out of this, which is, I think it's unstoppable and as well, I think irretrievable in the sense that it's really fantastic. But second is, how do you think this can be perceived in the rest of the world, because that's as well the challenge, is that when you go too fast, sometimes you create a lot of issues. So I think we can balance the two things. So on the part, just could you tell us about the Chinese role with this, and then we can go to the challenges.
Yeah, so actually 2 days ago, China just did the commercial launch on the mainland for this BSN, the blockchain-based services network, right? And this was a very massive, commercial launch. Basically, in 100 cities in China, there are now nodes, and China views this as their integrated smart city strategy, right? Because if you want to be able to conduct the ability to trade value and digital assets, and you need, before that, connect data so that heterogeneous data systems can then be combined so that you can sit cloud computing and AI and big data on top. You need to have some sort of infrastructure layer to combine all these heterogeneous data systems, right? And that becomes this blockchain services networks, right? So because of this backbone infrastructure status, now this BSN is really poised to be rapidly adopted by city governments, by state-owned enterprise, and by all the private companies. And all that has to be interoperable with this base protocol. So you can think of BSN essentially as an interoperability protocol. That's all it is, right? It allows you to translate between, say, Ethereum network or EOS. These are actual interoperability, standards which have already been incorporated in BSN. So if you're an Ethereum user and you want to do business with some private chain in China, now through the BSN you can connect, right? And so that's the fundamental basis of the BSN. But it's even more ambitious in the sense that this BSN network is also vertically integrated into all the blockchain-based cloud computing services. So already BSN is working with pretty much all the major cloud service providers in the West, notably AWS, Google, and Azure, and certainly all the Chinese side cloud providers, to vertically integrate a solution where you could be a node on the network, and then you can also get cloud-based services from any one of these providers. And because of the smart way that they multiplex the cloud service compute, they can provide these services at a fraction of the cost that a traditional cloud service provider usually charges, right? AWS is a typical example. The pricing for their integrated solution is on the order of $400 per year. Okay, so that means that any SME can now get these digital economy tools to conduct business online and spread it to different parts of the world. So already with these 100 cities, adopting the BSN, and it's going to very rapidly spread to 200 cities by the end of this year. We can say that China, again, I mentioned that China has enough of an ecosystem on its own on the demand side, where instantly when they decide to do this, they become the largest, blockchain based ecosystem in the world, right? Just with the mainland. And then, of course, in the next phase, China will want to globalize this new technology with all its trade partners, right? So that's the Belt and Road strategy, what is loosely called the Digital Silk Road, right? And that's 150 countries, 2/3 of the world's population, and 1/3 of global GDP. All these of China's trade partners, if they want to go and interoperate with trading data or value or eventually digital assets, will need to somehow interoperate with the BSN, right? So that's that aspect. Now, I think it's really in vogue these days for Western media to really, do the, state that this is, China's ambition to take over the world, or, that ability to surveil the whole world. I think those are in general misguided in the sense that the BSN protocol does not really hold state, right? So this is not, the China doesn't have an ability to, to surveil any of the traffic on top, because on top will of course be built all the cryptographically secure encrypted systems that you use in any other network. So a good example of that is the TCP protocol, right, which was developed by DARPA, but is now used by the whole free world as the internet, right? You're not worried about the governments to snoop, because on top you have cryptographically secure systems which enable you to do things in a private manner. So the same thing, right? There's no backdoors or this kind of thing in the BSN, because the backdoors don't mean anything. There's no state that needs help. All you're doing is transferring data from one place to the other, and that data is encrypted by normal standards, so you won't be able to see that. So I think certainly the West, is getting more hawkish, and this will be positioned as China chain or this kind of thing. But I think if you are principled and you actually understand technology, and you're not trying to politicize this, then what it ends up being is a interoperability protocol, which will allow any type of a blockchain ecosystem to connect to any other blockchain ecosystem, the same way that Polkadot or Cosmos does for different blockchain systems, like the interoperability protocol. So I think there's going to be a net positive benefit to allow the world to connect more synergistically, to allow new modes of collaboration and trust to exist where it hasn't existed before, to increase efficiency and allow the digitization of the world to happen more on a mass scale. And that's going to all benefit humanity.
So this is kind of amazing, to say less. So a couple of questions here. So one, looking at your opinion piece in CoinDesk, and as well researching some of the things that we found. So definitely there's a massive lack of information about this. So I hope there's more PR and communications, and as well proper demystification, like you just mentioned, because at the moment what people see is, okay, there's this thing happening in China, but no one really knows all this. So one of the things that is quite amazing, and I think this should be where we should focus, is, like you said, so the price is $400 per year, which is kind of fantastic price, to be honest, for something like this. And the second thing is that there's already 200 cities that are getting into this. And then you mentioned
100 cities have been on the network now. There's 100 nodes across 100 cities, but by the end of this year, the plan is to have 200. Yeah.
Exactly. And then as well, you mentioned as well 451 prefecture level cities thereafter. So these cities is it's all over the world, because one of the things that I want to highlight is that I think the world economy is becoming more dependent of cities than actually countries. Actually, with the countries, we have this kind of meltdown of geopolitics, but the cities are leading the world, whatever people want it or not. So a very important thing, and I think this is important for our audience and for everyone, because to be honest, no one actually spoke about this so far that I found, even in mainstream, with the exception of your opinion. I didn't find anything concrete, which is kind of a bit alarming. I saw the website, but even the website is only in Chinese, so it's difficult to find. And as well, even trying to translate, there's not so much really nitty-gritty. So can you explain, let's say, I'm a city, let's say I'm in London, okay, and I want to use this network, okay, where do I subscribe? How can this be implemented right now, or any city in Europe by soever, or in Africa, where we are actually working as well? So because I think this is where we need to use to demystify these issues and come back with the practicalities of the technology, which is kind of amazing in this case.
Yeah, I mean, so you pointed out that the initial sort of commercial launch was focused on the mainland, right? So the portal by which you can access these services is all in Chinese, as you mentioned. There's going to be a global version of that portal, which will be commercially announced in end of June, right? And at that time, there'll be English language and this kind of thing. Right now, you should be able to see a English-based white paper, so you can have a basic understanding of what's going on. But the commercial launch for, say, to connect to a node into in London or elsewhere, that will be coming in the next few months. But if you go onto the portal, then the whole point is basically a cloud management sort of interlayer. You can actually click on the different cloud providers, and you can order different amounts of compute with different levels of service, the number of transactions per second that you want to enable, and that kind of thing. And you're off to the races. And you know, actually, the protocol itself is essentially a Hyperledger fork, right? So it is interoperable with Hyperledger. It's already interoperable with EOS and Ethereum, and you know, there's a lot of you know, new connectivity that's going to be provided. But essentially, it's meant to connect to in a decentralized way to whatever other ecosystems matter, and allow you to interoperate, right? So and now. You know, for example, a lot of Western companies, I might mention Digital Asset, which has their own interesting formally verified smart contract technology called DAML, which allows very efficient ability to create working code, smart contract code that will allow you to do interesting things that will sit on as a layer on top. So, you know, there's a lot of, you know, the technology stack capabilities which will be built on top, which will allow anybody to very rapidly create their own dApp for the ecosystem. And the eventual goal, of course, is to put together a blockchain as a service layer. So essentially a dApp store, right, of services that will be interoperable with the protocol. Now in China, there's already thousands of developers developing all sorts of you know, interesting use cases, starting a lot with the smart cities case. So in Hangzhou, for example, they announced a partnership with BSN way back in I want to say December, right, where you know, they're trying to create a digital identity infrastructure, which now would certify you to be a user on the platform, to get access, for example, to city services like you know, registering company credentials, or you know, all sorts of other interesting use cases. So all that sort of technology will now be you know, commoditized and made available on the network. And so the innovation related to the ability to system integrate these little pieces of infrastructure together to create your own working solution, that will be massively accelerated.
Yeah, so this is really kind of amazing, and it brings a lot of opportunities. So you see this becoming like a democratization of a cloud computing system for cities and companies around the world, and the new operating system on blockchain. So where, coming back to the basis of blockchain, and you are an expert in crypto and blockchain, and you mentioned tokenization. So how is this going to be the governance of this blockchain system? Because in the end of the day, there's always a background. Let's say if you look at Google, the data in one end is controlled by Google. If you look at Amazon, is controlled by Amazon. And ultimately, who is behind the management of this as control? Of course, in blockchain, it's supposed to be decentralized. How do you explain that part for the critics or for the people that are perplexed with this? And because first of all, probably no one knows about this. And second, of course, there will be the second question. They will ask, okay, who is going to run this? Because it's a massive node, like you mentioned, that we're talking about billions of people just market in China. But then if you go to other cities and countries, it can be a massive. We're talking around the world, there's around over 1,500 cities, or at least cities 1,000. So if you're talking about 450, it's 50% of the cities in the world. So can you tell us a bit more on the nitty-gritty details of this?
Yeah, let's bump up and get a little bit more philosophical on the whole philosophy of decentralization. Right? I think this is a valid sort of starting point. You know, the whole history of humanity has been centralized systems, right? We got governments, we got banks, you know, you got Googles, right? Basically, the world has centralized access to information and that kind of thing. Now, the whole story of decentralization is now that we don't have to do that, right? And so when Bitcoin came out, we have a bunch of Bitcoin maximalists and people who were giddy with the idea of decentralization. And basically the idea was to go from full centralization to full decentralization, right? And I think, you know, full decentralization is kind of like communism, actually, okay? It's a system that it works well in theory, but not so well in practice. right?
Yes.
Because of incentivization, in terms of complexities of governance, and all sorts of these kind of things, right? So I'm kind of a middle way kind of guy, right? Meaning I am actually philosophically aligned to decentralization, but I'm a pragmatist, right? And I think that, going to full decentralization and basically disrupting all world economies and governments and institutions and going just to Bitcoin probably is not practical. Even if it were possible, not ideal, right? Because you cause a lot of disruption. Now, I believe that the best way to end up with decentralization is not to go first to decentralization, is to find a middle balance point where governments will, basically adopt blockchain, adopt some modest form of decentralization, something that's very comfortable to them, which is what the Chinese government has done now, right? They've stated that blockchain is such an important part of national strategy. They're implementing into smart cities and whatever. But decentralization is kind of like Pandora's box, right? Once you open up a centralized system to decentralization, it doesn't ever get back in the box. You can't go back to centralization, right? The world will just slowly decentralize more and more, but they can do so in a way that's comfortable for the people who are losing power, i.e. the governments, the bank institutions, whatever, right? So I practice this notion of minimally viable decentralization, this concept, okay? Where the idea now is, if you want to decentralize the central government of China, that's going to be a tough order. Short of, basically revolution of the Communist Party is going to be very difficult to do, right? And certainly the Communist Party is not willing to do that, right? But if you create a hybrid system, a blockchain system where now, it's fully permissioned right now, as you know, right? It's the BSN, of course, is a fully permissioned chain. Essentially the keys are in the hands of the central government. This, we all understand that, right? However, what happens in 5 years where, let's say, maybe the keys can be put into an independent judiciary as the central government becomes much more comfortable with the idea that, everything works and they still kind of have a modicum of control in the situation, whatever, and things can become more checks and balances and whatever. So we end up, I think, with a more and more decentralized system, but it's one that harmoniously connects the existing traditional world to the rest of the world. And I think we end up in a decentralized state, but in a much more graceful fashion. That's kind of my philosophy on this. So with respect to BSN, the same situation, right? The BSN is supposed to be an interoperability protocol, so it can connect a fully decentralized system like Ethereum or EOS to a fully centralized blockchain or permission chain of the type that Ant Financial has on the mainland, right? That's one. Second, I'd like to point out also that any decentralized system is not very. It's only theoretical, right? EOS is not a decentralized system, right? Ethereum is not Bitcoin is not a decentralized system insofar as there's literally a handful of whales which control most of the mining, whatever. So, as much as you say that it's a decentralized system, effectively it's just a handful of oligarchs controlling the system anyway, right? So, but that was level 1 blockchain. We are now level 4, and I'm sure by level 10, the 10th iteration of the blockchain ecosystems, we will get to a point where things are more enlightened in a decentralized fashion with the right governance structures and whatever, right? But in the meantime, right, I think we want the institutional world to adopt blockchain, right? That's good for everyone, including all the Bitcoin maximalists, right? So I think we're getting there quite significantly with something like a BSN, because it basically, at least China anyway, and all the institutions and all the governments and all the large-scale Fortune 500 companies are now going to adopt blockchain. And as my notion is, again, once they start adopting blockchain, they're going to end up more and more decentralized as these governance mechanisms become more and more refined.
Yeah, this is an entire interview on itself, and probably I'll come back to you on that, because it's definitely an area, because of my experience and yours. I think both of us have been building both crypto systems and tokenization. And this opens a lot of things from Pandora box to, I think, especially when it turns, like you said, the governance, because like you said, Bitcoin is not a democratic system, is not a decentralized, and no system it is. But well, moving forward, and I think not going to this point, and then I appreciate we're going to put links to your article and as well. We start already a big overview about all the things you've been doing. So I would like to talk about CarbonBlue because it's one of your main projects, and I think that is yours because the other ones is not completely yours. You are part of well, there's a huge network over there. But can you tell us about CarbonBlue? What is the ambition, and how you're taking in practice a lot of the things that you're talking?
Yeah, so CarbonBlue is meant to be a venture building company, right? And the idea here is applying a lot of the principles that I kind of loosely mentioned during my interview. Basically, the idea is that we want to take growth stage companies. Okay, so we want technology de-risk companies, right? Because I used to do the 0 to 1 thing, and there's a lot of tech risk, there's a lot of market risk. Even if you have a very successful hard team, there's a lot of things that would be hard to manage. So I want to focus on technologies that have been technology de-risked and also market de-risked, i.e. there's reference cases with reputable partners that say that this is something that's useful, right? And then CarbonBlue model is to help be a very strong strategic partner to take these technology de-risked companies and to rapidly scale. And you can kind of see the model that we're trying to scale with, right? It's connecting. It used to be taking a Western-based company with some value-added IP, strong intellectual property and technology, and then applying it into the greater China ecosystem, right? But these days, it also is going the other way because again, Chinese companies are now coming to the forefront in terms of leadership on a worldwide stage on things like AI and blockchain and things like that. But wherever the technology is sourced internationally, the idea is to really reduce the number of steps that it takes to scale. Okay, that means that you want to really partner that technology with an industry leader, right? Or in the case of, let's say, the BSN, you already have this very amazing scale strategy through the blockchain services network. You can actually scale at the country level, across countries, and that kind of thing, right? And then we focus on therefore, the minimal amount of effort to get to scale, which is usually identifying a test bed, either with a government or an industry leader, or where we take that technology and do a very top-down business model development or business developments to align interests, such that if the test bed gets completed and goes through, then it represents immediate commercialization with the testbed partner, which again could be the government or industry leader, to rapidly scale within that ecosystem. So therefore, it's basically trying to minimize the work of trial by error and sort of just kind of randomized sort of business development. It's very directed to doing the minimum set of things to scale to activity, right? And so these days, CarbonBlue is really focused on fintech innovation. Right? It's really focused on applying the technologies that will lead to fundamental general purpose technologies that can be deployed, say at a country level, right? Into these different developing ecosystems. And also it's focused on being amenable to be system integrated into solutions, right? So I mentioned before, I'm working now to make strategic partnerships with the leading best-in-class, institutional-grade fintech infrastructure companies in the world, right? Whether it's exchange technologies, whether it's digital wallet technologies, whether, again, it's KYC or custodial platforms or tokenization platforms. So I'm basically just want to get the best-in-class partners who already have demonstrated credibility with reference cases with governments or whatever, but they don't really have the scale story to be able to rapidly deploy. And then from that sense, CarbonBlue can be a very strong strategic partner. We'll take your digital exchange technology, and then we'll literally bang down different countries and help you establish a footprint in each country, doing, say a digital commodities exchange in a certain area, or et cetera, et cetera. So that's one aspect of things. The other aspect of things is the finance innovation, right? I think I talked about the business model innovation that is enabled by tokenization and asset backing any type of value to a digital asset, right? So I'm very, very interested in the business model innovation around creating what we call PPPs, like public-private partnerships, right? I'm working now working with the UN ESCAP, the Economic and Social Commission of Asia Pacific. They're very interested in driving sustainable development goals in, Jaden, I'm on the phone. Enabling sustainable development goals in the world, right? And there's literally a gap of about $7 to $9 trillion in terms of funding that will enable to push the UN goals by 2030, right? Traditional government-led financing is not going to enable these goals for humanity, right? You need to have the private sector involved into this, right? So therefore, I'm thinking about these very new models of public-private partnerships where we can get private sector money to align interests with public initiatives, like building infrastructure for digital economies in developing regions, right? And then looking at ways that we can actually put together models which would enable, the private sector and private interests to align with public good, right? And so that, I think, is all the tokenization aspects. We are working now with a variety of these sort of interesting use cases to be able to do that, right?
Yeah, that's quite amazing, especially the idea between scale, the fintech innovation, and then of course the public-private partnerships. I think is going to be increasingly more important, the tokenization. So we passed already the benchmark of 1 hour, which is, there's a lot of stuff here. Is a bit I would say that we have material for probably 4 hours, but let's try to wrap up. So, and of course we're going to put a lot of links to a lot of the things you mentioned, and I think like I mentioned, this is going to be in our YouTube channels, but it's going to be as well on Spotify and a lot of other different channels. We are as well looking at starting to put some things in Tencent over there. But one of the things that I want to do to wrap up. So how do you see, and especially being an academic and the practitioners and as well an investor, how do you see this bridge between the definition of fintech and as well? So when it comes to CarbonBlue, let's say, you mentioned a couple of, we mentioned previously 1 or 2 solutions, like the Bangladesh example, and you mentioned right now a lot of countries and special tokenization and different areas. So can you just pick, and special right now, you mentioned the United Nations case that you are working. Is there one specific case study that you want to wrap up to leverage both the ideas and the other things for us to have that part in the right angle? Because that, I think, would be really important for us and for the people who listen to this.
Yeah, so I'll give an example, right? I think one of the critical pieces of infrastructure for digital economies is, of course, the data center, right? And so, you would want to actually provide data center infrastructure development in these developing regions to support all the, online stuff that happens on top, right? Data centers are notoriously expensive, right? And actually there's a lot of risk if, we go to create a data center in the developing economy from the standpoint of whether or not it's going to be a viable, positive IRR type investment kind of thing, right? So we are now working, as an example, with a company called Renewable Development Corporation to create green hybrid power integrated data centers. Because the other big problem with these developing economies is that the power infrastructure is not that great. The electric grid is not that stable. So if you want to create a data center that has an uninterrupted power supply, it's very difficult. So we integrate both things together. And what's interesting there is the business model innovation. If you have a integrated powered data center, then you're providing the power, which drives the data center. But in the beginning, where there isn't that much load or customers on the data center, basically the excess power can be actually sold back to the grid, to the government through what we call a long-term purchase power agreement, PPA. That is a revenue stream. Plus, because it's a green data center, now there's carbon credits that could be generated. Plus, there's the traditional data center business, which with this SaaS model or whatever it is, right? If you combine all these revenue streams together, this starts to look like a positive IRR project that a international investment bank, say Morgan Stanley or one of the big guys, would view as something that's business viable, right? And so we are looking to therefore create interesting digital finance strategies, okay, which will allow even the tokenization, some interesting strategies. So for example, in the PPA agreement, we can actually take the PPA and asset back it into a digital asset, and then create a whole exchange to trade in the digital assets of asset-backed, digital assets, right? So there's a whole ecosystem that can actually develop around this using interesting financing techniques. The other aspect of things is the infrastructure, right? The infrastructure now, we have the ability to get financing from, if it's a Belt and Road project, we can get financing from AIAB, right? The Asian International Infrastructure Bank, right? But we can get Western parties as well. So now we have this sort of, again, this win-win model where it's not like traditional China Belt and Road projects where only China's investing into these countries, but now it could be invested by Western parties and the Chinese side to co-develop this digital economy, which would drive a lot of development. The next generation of growth for nations, anything growing above a few percent, in the pre-COVID world anyway, they were all developing nations in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, Latin America. These are the next the focuses for development, and so we really want to create innovative financial engineered structures which will allow private investments, both sides of the West and the East, and also aligns to be enabled for digital assetization, all to come together. And so that's an example of a project that we are now replicating in a few areas in Asia.
Oh, amazing. And so, Michael, as we have probably past 1 hour, so for the sake of some of the channels, don't accept much more than this. So we'll continue definitely, because I think there's a couple of angles that I would like to do, especially in tokenization, digital assets, and as well more on the philosophies and the dynamic, more on the ideologies part of blockchain and different areas. But for synthesizing, where can people find you? And as well, to summarize, a fantastic interview where we touched so much different things. Where can people find you? Where people can find CarbonBlue? Other information, I know that you write for a lot of these things. I think it's important that people know this, because I think one of the things people, especially people like us, we should not forget the dimension of dynamics of understanding where people can actually demystify and read about these things, especially as you as an academic.
Oh, I mean, different forms. My email is msung@carbon.blue. So happy to entertain people who want to, partner or connect. I also have I think a pretty easily searchable LinkedIn profile. You can add me on WeChat or your WhatsApp, so any of these sort of modes of communication, I'd be happy to provide information and links.
And on your thought leadership, because you write recently for CoinDesk, but you're writing some of those things and some of your theses, especially the most advanced cutting edge stuff that you've been working. Is there any place where people can read about it?
Yeah, I mean, I am now starting to get into the phase where I'm trying to write a little bit more. So certainly on my LinkedIn, and also, yes, I'll probably be contributing more to CoinDesk and some of these other platforms as well. Yeah.
Well, on Cities ABC as well. Okay, very good. Well,
absolutely, yes.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think we could speak for hours, but I think the purpose of we passed 1 hour, so I think we'll let for the next. I think we'll continue with the second interview, probably about more of the things we touch. So it's an honor. There's a lot of things here. We're going to put most of the notes about CarbonBlue, about your work and some of your papers as well, and this part of centralized systems, some notes and some quotes in the interview, and as well we will syndicate these in a lot of channels. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you here, and talk soon.
Dinis, a pleasure. Thank you very much.